1988 was a big year for Brisbane. The city was on the global map hosting the World's Fair, Expo 88. It also saw the opening of new shops, new buildings, new tourist attractions, and the opening of a brand new airport. The new Brisbane airport had been relocated from its former place at Eagle Farm with a larger airfield built to accommodate the anticipated growth of the city for the decades to come. But only some years before its unveiling, the landscape of the new airport had once been a Brisbane suburb, only to be controversially cleared out and wiped off the map. This had once been a quiet coastal township that had stood as a thriving beach holiday destination, a home for those struggling to get by, and the one-time stomping ground for one of the world's most successful musical groups. This was once the location of Brisbane's lost suburb, Cribb Island. Cribb Island was a coastal suburb 11 kilometres north of central Brisbane within the locality of Nudgee, stretching 4 kilometres and located northeast of the suburbs Northgate and Nunda. Despite its name, Cribb Island wasn't exactly a true island. The area was only disconnected from the mainland by 2 creeks, mangroves and mudflats, which would increase in water volume at high tide. Its outer beach overlooked the vast Moreton Bay. The lands that would later be named Cribb Island were part of the Yuggera country, inhabited by the Yuggera and Turrbal peoples. The island's surrounding areas were densely populated and were used as coastal trading areas with several bora rings. Many of these ceremonial bora rings were unfortunately destroyed by European settlers, and the current Nudgee bora ring is one of a few surviving within present-day Brisbane. The word Nudgee comes from the Yuggera language and means place of ducks. European settlers would regularly trade their potatoes and bread for fish and mud crabs caught by the local Turrbal people. German missionaries at the nearby Zion's Hill, now the location of modern-day Nunda, were led by Karl Wilhelm Schmidt and Christopher Epper in 1838 with the aim to convert indigenous locals to Christianity. The mission was not successful and closed in 1843. Much later, a young English immigrant by the name of James Jackson would move to the Nunda area to live and work as a dairy farmer. In 1863, John George Cribb, the son of Brisbane alderman Robert Cribb, bought 150 acres of the coastal land neighbouring present-day Nudgee from the Queensland government. Cribb named the land after himself, Cribb's Island, and used it for general farming purposes. Almost 30 years later, in 1896, 22-year-old James Jackson would buy approximately 60 acres of the land from Cribb. Jackson, together with his wife Ella, settled on the land which they called the Bramble Farm, where they grew pineapples, watermelons and bananas. Jackson's farm later extended to a fruit preservation business, and he would go on to establish a successful cannery on the island, with many of Jackson's canned goods widely distributed to troops in the First World War. Because of Cribb Island's isolation from the mainland by the flats, Jackson would transport his produce downriver to the Brisbane markets in a makeshift boat called the Bramble. Around 1912, possibly earlier, Brisbane residents would often approach Jackson asking to camp on his property on the weekends for a small fee. He obliged. Many of these locals would leave their tent setups behind, only to have them blown away or damaged by winds or storms. Jackson was later approached with another proposal of leasing out portions of his land for permanent seaside camps, and thus the Bramble Farm Camp was born. The camp area was immediately popular with an entertainment hall built, and by 1916, more than 100 camps were set up on Jackson's estate, with many people coming to Cribb Island for their weekends and holidays. This would then spur the next stage of Cribb Island's development. John George Cribb's estate would continue to be used by farmers until in 1913, when the land was sold off for residential subdivision. A suburb soon began to flourish within Cribb Island. Well-off Brisbane residents would continue to set up their holiday homes and weekender beach houses on Jackson's estate. A set of sea baths were built on the beach that were regularly enjoyed by its visitors. Motorised transport in Brisbane was still in its early days, and thusly Cribb Island was relatively closer to get to from the city than, say, Caloundra or Southport for a seaside holiday. After much petitioning from James Jackson, a causeway was built across the mudflats in 1918 by the Toombul Shire Council, allowing the growing use of motor transport to the island. This road across the flats was constructed from oak logs covered in soil and gravel. However, this road was often at the mercy of the flats at high tide, and vehicles would regularly sink into the muddy roads along the way. As the 1920s arrived, Cribb Island continued to grow, with over 250 inhabitants residing and over 500 beach houses dotted across Jackson's estate. During this period of growth came a school, a post office and kiosk, a movie theatre, and in 1925 a private bus service to and from the suburb. Throughout the Roaring Twenties, Cribb Island was on the rise as Brisbane's best seaside resort and holiday destination. But the island's golden years were soon to run out very quickly. During the 1930s, the Great Depression was felt the whole world over, Australia included. Unemployment in Australia reached a peak of 32% by 1932. Tens of thousands of Australians would move around the country looking for work. The economic downturn of the 1930s also brought Cribb Island's time in the sun to a premature end. The number of incoming tourists and holiday makers to Cribb Island decreased rapidly, and many of the beach houses of Jackson's estate were sold off for very low prices and were bought up by many locals struggling through the Depression. James Jackson's cannery had also closed down, and he returned to his former trade of dairy farming, providing for the local community. The suburb's population soon increased to approximately 1,200 people. It would take Australia a full decade to recover from the Great Depression, but these circumstances would have a lasting impact on Cribb Island for the decades to come. But it wasn't all just doom and gloom for those who lived at the suburb. A tight-knit community soon forged amongst the residents of Cribbie, as it became affectionately known. United in their local solidarity, many residents and families enjoyed their lives by the sea, fishing, swimming and playing by the beach or the creek, watching films at the theatre or enjoying local events at the community hall. Said local resident Betty Conway, "It was a wonderful place to live and I missed the lifestyle. I loved school and the companionship. Every afternoon we would play on the beach. We were never bored. Our backyard was Bramble Bay." Cribb Island may not have looked like much at the time, but it was home to many a Brisbane resident just trying to get by while enjoying a quaint life by the seaside. And in the 1960s, Cribb Island would become the location for a local success story. In August of 1956, a family from England had decided to emigrate for Australia. Their names were Hugh and Barbara Gibb. Together with their daughter Leslie and sons Barry, Robin, Morris and infant Andy, the family made their way on board the ship Fairsea, bound for Queensland. Once settling, the Gibb family would spend 4 years living in Redcliffe before moving to Cribb Island in 1960. Outside of school, young Barry and his brothers Robin and Morris often performed together as a musical act, singing together at various local events throughout Brisbane and surrounds. The three brothers would go on to achieve further success with their first television appearances in Brisbane that year, and would continue to perform around Australia, before moving back to the UK in 1967. This band would become known as the Bee Gees. The Bee Gees went on to become one of the most commercially successful groups in the world and were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1997. Youngest sibling Andy Gibb would go on to have a solo career of his own before his untimely death in 1988 at the young age of 30. The Gibb brothers continued to write and perform together until the passing of Morris in 2003 and Robin in 2012. Despite the success stories and the love and solidarity of its local residents, Cribb Island's public image declined as the suburb crawled on through the 1960s. The ecology of the Cribb Island area was also suffering, with erosion on the beachfronts becoming a growing problem and beachside houses washing away by the high tides. The town roads would continue to endure regular floods, and storms brought on by the 1967 cyclone Dinah ravaged the town, washing away much sand and soil and collapsing many more beachside homes. Residents attempted to stop their homes from washing away by placing lines and lines of discarded rubber tyres on the beach. This also became a massive environmental issue unto itself, unsightly for the once popular beaches and emitting an odious stench in the summer heat. Cribb Island had become a shadow of its former self, there was no doubt about it. Many outsiders and other sidelining detractors would write Cribb Island off as unsavoury and a dangerous place to live. Local newspapers would often publish articles pleading for an urban renewal of Cribb Island or removal of the suburb altogether. All the while, Cribbie residents would continue to stand proud in defence of their seaside hometown. A proposal was put forward in 1966 to redevelop the Nudgee coastal region, while other articles continued to treat the suburb as a Brisbane punchline. It was almost as if these journal articles were trying to turn Brisbane public against Cribb Island in the 60s and 70s, especially with what was soon about to come for the township. 5 kilometres south of Cribb Island lay the suburb of Eagle Farm. Initially used as an aviation landing field in 1922, Brisbane's first airport was officially established at the Eagle Farm area in 1925. It was a popular airport for many of Australia's early aviation pioneers, namely Bert Hinkler and Charles Kingston Smith, who landed here following the first Trans-Pacific flight from California. The Brisbane airport also saw the beginnings of the Royal Flying Doctor Service. By the 1960s, Brisbane's population was increasing, with an anticipated growth to 1 million people by the following decade. As the city was growing, so were the needs of its airport, and plans were put forward to expand the facility. A new location was needed to accommodate its expansion and predicted future growth. A large parcel of land northeast of the airport overlooking Moreton Bay was thus chosen by the Commonwealth Government. This land was to resume parts of Nudgee, Landers Pocket, and the entirety of Cribb Island. Residents were notably outraged and fiercely protested the government resumption of the place they'd called home for the past 50 years. The Cribb Island community would regularly band together at the local school hall to fight the impending takeover, but by 1974, their efforts were overruled by bureaucracy. The residents of Cribb Island were firmly told by the federal authorities to leave the suburb, and demolition soon began. By 1975, the once populous suburb of Cribb Island had been reduced to a ghost town, with most of its residents gone and its buildings left vacant. All of the old beach houses of Jackson's estate lay empty and derelict, despondent reminders of the town's past. Former residents would regularly drive back to the old suburb to pay it one final farewell, while vandals would add their own to the town's demise to little concern. From 1978 to 1980, the last few residents made their exit from Cribb Island, with the exception of one. 80-year-old Russian-born widow Alexandra Jones steadfastly refused to leave her home, which had been bought by her late husband 33 years prior. Unmoved by the noises of demolition crews, bulldozers, and the wishes of federal authorities, Ms. Jones stayed in her Cribb Island home, living on kind offerings of food and water from friends. "I'll stay here until the day I die, so please tell them all out there they don't have to shoot me to get rid of me." Alexandra Jones unwillingly left her Cribb Island home in April of 1980. The area was closed off to the public as work began on the new Brisbane airport on the 5th of June that year. Cribb Island was cleared of all of its homes, buildings, shops and facilities, and was eventually removed from all Brisbane suburban maps. By the 1980s, Cribb Island was no more. Construction of the new airport continued on throughout the 1980s. 14 million cubic metres of sand were dredged from Moreton Bay to stabilise the swampy surrounding lands. Construction of the terminal and tower were completed in 1987, and after 8 years of work, the new Brisbane airport was officially opened on the 19th of March 1988 by Prime Minister Bob Hawke. The former Eagle Farm airport closed the following day, with its final departure taking off at 2:45 p.m. The former Cribb Island area now sits completely abandoned and emptied, and buried beneath the current airport runway. All that remains of the old suburb is the former entrance to Cribb Island Road near the Jim Sawley Bikeway in Nudgee, and the slowly deteriorating bathhouse foundations facing out to Moreton Bay. Former residents have managed to keep the memories of Cribb Island alive in various weblogs, Facebook groups and books. Former resident Tracy Burton released the book On the Flats, about her childhood experiences of Cribb Island in the 1970s. And James Jackson's grandson, James William Jackson, has released his own book, Cribb Island as It Was. Cribbie, a stage musical play, made its 2012 debut in Brisbane. The play, written by Marjorie and Michael Ford, is about the life and times of the township, its united community, and its eventual end. And in 2018, a photo gallery and mini museum dedicated to Cribb Island was opened at the Brisbane Airport Ibis Hotel. This gallery can be found at the hotel bar, aptly titled the Cribb Island Beach Club. This restaurant and bar has often been a reunion venue for many Cribb Island former residents getting together and reminiscing about their former hometown. While the suburb of Cribb Island might be long gone, its memories and legacy will continue to carry on throughout Brisbane.